The Senate killed the Korean War on a Tuesday afternoon. On June 28, 1950, 3 days after 75,000 North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel, President Harry Truman stood before Congress and asked for a formal declaration of war. It was a decision that broke with his own instincts. His advisers, led by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, had urged him to act unilaterally to commit American forces under the authority of United Nations Security Council Resolution 83, which had passed 2 days earlier only because the Soviet Union was boycotting the council over Chinese representation. But Truman, mindful of the constitutional arguments that Senator Robert Taft of Ohio had been sharpening for months, chose to do it by the book. He would let Congress decide. What followed was not a ringing debate between interventionists and isolationists. It was something quieter and more corrosive, a slow collapse of political will. Taft argued that committing ground troops to mainland Asia was a strategic trap, that the United States had no vital interest on the Korean Peninsula, and that Dean Acheson himself had excluded Korea from the American defensive perimeter just 6 months earlier at the National Press Club. The arguments were not frivolous. They were held by serious legislators with genuine constitutional convictions. But what no one in that chamber fully understood, what wouldn't become clear for years, was that their vote would redraw the map of Asia. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The declaration fell short of the 2/3 majority. Truman boxed in, authorized naval escorts and supply shipments to South Korea. But no combat troops, no air superiority missions, no Douglas MacArthur wading ashore at Incheon. The Republic of Korea would fight alone. Seoul fell on June 28, the same day it fell in reality, because the city's fate was never in American hands. The North Korean People's Army crossed the Han River with Soviet-built T-34 tanks that the South Korean Army had no weapons to stop. The Republic of Korea Army was a force built for internal security, not mechanized warfare. It had no tanks of its own, no heavy artillery, no adequate anti-armor capability. President Syngman Rhee's government fled south even as the bridges behind them were blown prematurely, stranding thousands of retreating soldiers and civilians on the wrong side of the river. In reality, the next weeks would have seen American air power and the first elements of the 24th Infantry Division arriving to slow the advance. In this timeline, none of that came. Rogue forces fought a desperate withdrawal southward, trading space for time with no reinforcement waiting at the end of the retreat. The Nakdong River line, which in our history became the backbone of the Pusan perimeter, never solidified. Without American close air support to interdict North Korean supply lines, without American armor to anchor defensive positions, the river crossings were contested and lost within days. Rhee's government relocated to Busan, then, as the perimeter collapsed around them, to a South Korean naval vessel anchored offshore. The president, who had ruled with an authoritarian grip, now governed nothing but the deck beneath his feet. The Pusan perimeter, as history remembers it, was one of the great defensive stands of the 20th century. 25,000 American troops, fighting alongside ROK forces, held a rectangular pocket around Korea's southeastern port against relentless North Korean assault through the brutal summer of 1950. But in this timeline, those 25,000 Americans never came. ROK commanders attempted to hold the same ground with the same river lines, but the mathematics were unforgiving. By mid-August, KPA forces breached the perimeter in 3 places simultaneously. The defensive line didn't collapse all at once. It frayed, then tore, then disintegrated. Busan fell in early September. Syngman Rhee was evacuated to Japan, a president in exile of a country that no longer existed on any functioning map. Organized South Korean resistance ended, but the fighting didn't. In the Taebaek Mountains and the rugged southern interior, thousands of ROK soldiers and anti-communist civilians melted into guerrilla bands. They would fight for years, poorly supplied, increasingly desperate, and largely forgotten. The brutality of the occupation would ensure they never lacked recruits, but they would never retake a single city. On September 15, 1950, the same date that, in our timeline, MacArthur's forces stormed ashore at Incheon, Kim Il-sung stood before a crowd in Seoul and declared the reunification of Korea under the Democratic People's Republic. The war, he announced, was over. The consolidation was just beginning. What followed was methodical and merciless. Mass executions of ROC government officials, police officers, landowners, and anyone suspected of collaboration with the southern regime swept through every province. The Bodo League, a registry of suspected communist sympathizers that Rhee's own forces had used to carry out tens of thousands of killings earlier that summer, now became a target list in reverse. Entire communities were liquidated. The death toll in the first 6 months of consolidation would never be precisely counted, but conservative estimates placed it above 100,000. Stalin celebrated what he called a strategic windfall. A unified communist Korea extended Soviet influence to the Tsushima Strait, barely 100 miles from the Japanese home islands. Mao Zedong, who had been preparing hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops to intervene in a prolonged Korean war, instead redirected those forces toward the consolidation of Tibet. The consequences of this rebalancing would ripple across Asia for decades. But first, the shockwave would hit Japan. For Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, the fall of Korea was both a nightmare and a trap. Japan in 1950 was still under Allied occupation, governed under SCAP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, led by General Douglas MacArthur from his headquarters in Tokyo. Article 9 of Japan's 1947 Constitution, drafted under American supervision, renounced war and the maintenance of armed forces. It was the most pacifist governing document in modern history. And now MacArthur, the man whose occupation authority had enshrined that pacifism, was demanding that Japan abandon it. The National Police Reserve, a lightly armed paramilitary force of 75,000 that had been established in August 1950 after American troops deployed to Korea in our timeline, existed in this timeline too, but under far greater pressure to expand. MacArthur pushed Yoshida to accept rapid, large-scale rearmament, a standing army, a navy, an air force. A communist Korea across the strait terrified the Japanese public, but it also inflamed the pacifist movement that had grown deep roots in the 5 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yoshida tried to thread an impossible needle. He could not refuse the Americans, who still controlled his country. He could not embrace full rearmament without tearing Japanese society apart. And the decision he eventually reached would satisfy neither side and change Japan forever. Under relentless American pressure, Japan established the National Safety Force in 1952, a military in everything but name. 180,000 personnel. Naval patrol vessels that looked remarkably like destroyers. A fledgling air wing equipped with American-supplied F-86 Sabres. The Emperor's government called it a self-defense organization. No one was fooled. Article 9 was not amended. That would have required a national referendum that Yoshida knew he would lose. Instead, it was reinterpreted, a legal fiction that held that the Constitution's renunciation of war did not prohibit the maintenance of defensive capabilities. Constitutional scholars on the left called it a coup against the document itself. Constitutional scholars on the right called it pragmatic survival. Massive protests erupted in Tokyo and Osaka. Students and labor unions filled the streets for weeks. The Japanese left warned that the country was sliding back toward the militarism that had destroyed it a decade earlier, that the Americans were rebuilding Japan as a weapon aimed at the Asian mainland. The protests were met with tear gas and mass arrests by the same National Police Reserve that was supposed to represent Japan's gentle, unarmed future. The irony was lost on no one. The San Francisco Peace Treaty of September 1951 restored Japanese sovereignty, but the price was steep. In our timeline, the accompanying U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was already controversial, a bargain in which Japan traded basing rights for an American defense guarantee. In this timeline, with a unified communist Korea staring across the strait, the Security Pact was far more aggressive. American bases in Japan expanded dramatically. The U.S. forward-deployed nuclear-capable B-47 bombers to Okinawa and Misawa Air Base in northern Honshu. Japan was no longer just an ally. It was the front line. Back in Washington, the Korea debacle consumed what remained of Truman's presidency. The man who had defeated Dewey against all odds in 1948 was now politically radioactive. Republicans hammered him for losing Korea while simultaneously arguing that he should never have sought a war declaration in the first place. The contradiction didn't matter. In politics, failure is its own indictment. Truman declined to run for re-election in 1952, and Dwight Eisenhower won in a landslide carried partly by his promise to contain the Asian Communist bloc through strength rather than what his campaign called Truman's paralysis. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, not a battle or a treaty, but a budget line. By 1955, Japan possessed the fourth largest military budget in the non-communist world. The National Safety Force had been quietly renamed the Japan's Self-Defense Forces, its ranks swelling, its equipment modernizing, its mission expanding from coastal patrol to regional deterrence. American nuclear weapons sat in bunkers on Japanese soil, pointed across the Sea of Japan at a unified Korea, where Soviet advisors helped Kim Il-sung build one of the most militarized societies on Earth. The Tsushima Strait, that narrow passage between Japan and Korea, where half a century earlier, Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian fleet, replaced the 38th parallel as the Cold War's most dangerous flashpoint in Asia. Naval patrols from both sides shadowed each other daily. Incidents were frequent. Escalation was always one miscalculation away, and in the cities of Japan, a quieter crisis unfolded. Korean refugees numbering over 600,000 had become a permanent stateless underclass, citizens of a country that no longer existed in a form they recognized, residents of a nation that refused them full belonging. They lived in segregated neighborhoods, worked jobs no one else wanted, and raised children who spoke Japanese but would never be Japanese. Their presence was a living reminder of the war that wasn't fought. The question that haunted American foreign policy for a generation was deceptively simple. Could one Senate vote have changed the course of Asia? The isolationists who blocked the declaration believed they were keeping America out of an unnecessary war. They may have been right about the war, but they were wrong about what would fill the vacuum. Because the lesson of Korea was not that intervention was always wise. It was that the absence of a decision is itself a decision, and the consequences belong to everyone who chose not to act.